Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be introducing the book of Nehemiah. To start with, we want to go all the way back to the beginning of the Old Testament, a good place to start with Nehemiah, back to the days of Abraham, when God spoke to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and gave them a promised land, and of course then you remember he took them to Egypt, and he used Egypt as sort of a natural incubator for his people, and then brought them out in the Exodus, gave them his law, and finally brought them into the promised land. And you have the books of Joshua and Judges as they're in the land of promise. And that whole story there is told in the Torah, and then you've got the books of Joshua and Judges after that. And once they get into the land, he gives them first Judges, and then a series of kings. There's Saul and David and Solomon, and the kingdom is divided. So you have the kings of Israel and Judah, and God says, as long as you obey me, I'll plant you in the land, I'll be with you, I'll bless you. But they didn't. And he had warned them, if they disobeyed, then they would be taken out of that land, and that's exactly what took place. In the year 721 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel was taken away into captivity, and then again a second captivity happened in the year 586 BC, where the people of Babylon, the Babylonians, came and they destroyed Jerusalem, and they burnt the temple, and they took the Jews into captivity. And now, as our story opens, we're getting ready for the return. It's actually taken place already in the book of Nehemiah, and all of these are the historical books. The last three of the historical books are the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So here they are. In the book of Ezra, you have the return of the Jews, where the Babylon has fallen, and now there's a new king on the throne, the king of Persia. And the Jews return in the year 539, well, actually 539 BC. The edict goes out, and the return, it takes a couple of years for it to start. And they come back into the land, and they begin to rebuild the temple, and that rebuilding is halted, but then it starts up again, so that the book of Ezra, chapters 1 through 6, tell the story of them coming back in the land and finally rebuilding the temple. Like I said, it doesn't happen immediately. It's over a period of a number of years, close to 20 years. But finally, the temple is rebuilt. And then you turn to Ezra chapter 7, and you are going to jump forward a number of years. But in the interval, you've had the events of the book of Esther that took place around 473 BC. I'm just approximating. I don't know if we can give an exact date. But you have the events of the book of Esther. And then you go forward a little bit. I remember we're BC, so we're going backwards in numbers. The numbers are going downhill, but that's because it's before Christ. And so around 458 to 457 BC, you have Ezra's story now. Ezra now leads a second group of Jewish people back into the land, and the temple's already rebuilt, but they correct some of the things that are lacking and some of the things that are deficient. So we could call the first part of the book of Ezra coming back to the land, rebuilding the temple, and the second part of the book of Ezra coming back into the land and maybe rebuilding the people. And that takes us now to the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, there's going to, if I can call it this, I'm going to call it another return. It's not like a big migration, but it's Nehemiah, and he's bringing some people with him. And they're going to come back into the land as well, not to rebuild the temple this time, but to rebuild the wall. So Nehemiah starts off, Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1, the words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Notice that the book of Nehemiah is actually written by Nehemiah. Book of Ezra might have been written by Ezra, but we're not actually told that. We don't know for sure. We make that assumption, and it's probably right. There's other books of the Old Testament, for example, the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Even though they're named after Samuel, they're not written by Samuel, because he dies halfway through 1st Samuel. So he didn't write those books. We don't know who wrote 1st and 2nd Kings. We don't know who wrote 1st and 2nd Chronicles. But Nehemiah is written by Nehemiah. And it's going to read, actually it's going to be written in the first person. Nehemiah's going to say, I did this, and I did that, and I prayed. And it's actually going to give a number of his prayers. So that I think Nehemiah reads a little bit like a private prayer journal. Now, the book is arranged, I guess you could arrange it in 5 parts. Then the first section, Nehemiah talks to God, and we're going to be looking at that next time. He talks to God, and then he talks to the people. And when you talk to God, we call that prayer. So it's going to be his prayer journal part, although we're going to see that again later on too. And then he'll come back to Jerusalem, and they'll begin the work. And he'll plan on it, and he'll share that plan with the people, and then they're going to do the work. And by the time we get to chapter 6, the wall of Jerusalem, the walls of the city, will have been rebuilt. And we think of Nehemiah usually, but it's the story of building the walls. But that's done in chapter 6, and there's a lot more to come. So that in chapter 7, we're given a number of the people. Sort of reminds me of the book of Numbers, where the people are numbered. Book of Numbers is about a lot more things than just that, but that does take place in the book of Numbers, hence the title. And then chapters 8 through 12 is going to be the covenant renewal, where we have the rebuilding of the wall. Now we're rebuilding the people. And then chapter 13, there's further reform. So the first section is going to deal with the work of the wall, and the second section, we could call it the worship of God, the people worshiping God. The first section, the rebuilding the wall. The second section, rebuilding, or as I put here, reviving the people.